All right, Dr. Selena Fisk, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Lucas.
It's an absolute pleasure. So, the data driven instruction, the data, that has been a, a theme of. I had someone on the podcast about a year ago, and her name was Andrea Spears, and she's a comedian. And she does teacher comedy. And so she said that she walked out on stage one time and she just said the words data driven instruction into the mic. And I got a roar of laughter from a huge theater. So clearly, this is something that's like, I gather from that reaction, it's something that's pretty much just put out there all the time, but not exactly understood. And maybe everyone has a different definition of how they use it, what they look for, and how they track. So I guess first off, tell me about how you were kind of in teaching, came across like a data driven curriculum, and I guess how that changed things for you and how you saw this as like a path to pursue to kind of master.
Yeah, I think the reaction to that comedian is something that I see all the time, like just
Yeah.
the word I say data,
It's like,
because I'm Australian. But it's a really divisive topic, to be honest. There's people who love
mhm,
it, there's people who hate it, and there's a whole lot of people in the middle who don't know what they're meant to think. So
mhm.
for me, coming out of my teacher training in Australia in 2004, I taught for a little bit in Australia, and data was just, it wasn't a thing. We marked the roll, we marked student work on an A to E scale in Australia, on a 5-point scale. And it just wasn't part of my world. And I went to the UK to teach over there, and I got a job as head of phys ed. So I'm secondary trained PE and maths teacher. So in Australia, you have to kind of do two quite different subject areas as a secondary teacher.
Mr. Clark After Dark is brought to you by Luxy. That's Luxy. Luxy is the standard for modern dating as it gives you a greater understanding of any potential match's intentions and background before you make your move. Swiping endlessly in other dating apps can be exhausting and often leave you with only the leftovers in your dating pool. Luxy is an exclusive platform with just a 10 to 15% acceptance rate, as well as a profile and income verification feature so you can be confident you're only connecting with those who meet your high standards. The community guidelines emphasize safety, trust, and equality by strictly prohibiting scams, explicit content, and harassment. 2025 is your year to stop settling. With Luxy, there is no luck involved, just real connections with people who truly match what it is you are looking for. Download the Luxy app today to see if you qualify for a better chance at finding the right person for you. And now, back to the show. Interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and a really interesting combination. And I think, to be honest,
Yeah.
part of the reason why it's led to me doing the work that I do now, because it's kind of the real human collaborative.
Yeah, true. With the numbers, yeah.
Yeah, but then with the numbers as well. And so I worked, as a supply teacher for a little bit, and I got a permanent job as head of physical education. And it was made very clear to me that my number one responsibility in that role was to increase the pass rate of the senior students. So before I started, there was only about a quarter of the students were passing senior physical education, which was actually an elective subject. Yeah, wild,
Wow.
right? Wild
Okay.
that it
That
was
seems
one
alarming.
and the fact that they're all choosing to be there. So it's not a compulsory
Yes.
subject, it's a
Okay.
board subject. And so they said,
That's a crazy situation to be thrown into. It's like everyone's choosing this, but everyone's failing. Figure it out.
yeah, exactly. It reminds me of when I did a stats subject at uni and I walked into my very first lecture and the lecturer said, 25% of you are going to pass. Are you going to be the 1 in 4 or are you going to be in the 3 in 4? It was, yeah, reminiscent of uni days. And so I guess it was really clear, really like made clear to me that there was an expectation that I increased the pass rate. And it was a new curriculum to me, being obviously trained in Australia. And so I had to learn a lot about how to essentially play the game to get the marks that students needed to get them over the line. And the only way I knew to do that, because I didn't have a great solid understanding of the curriculum, was to learn through collecting really good evidence of, well, where are they? What do they need to work on? And then how do I get them across the line? And so I started predicting grades and working out kind of where I thought they would be around the practical components of the subject. So it was about 40%
Okay.
practical at the time and 60% theory. And so we were anticipating the practical grades that they were going to get. We were doing mock practice exams, and I was getting a bit of data on where they were sitting in terms of their theory. And then I was estimating where I thought they would end up at the end of the year in their external exams. So it was Kind of, to be honest, it was trial and error. And that's the case for many of the data people, the people who love this type of stuff and use data all the time in their schools. Most of them have just worked their way through this and learned themselves or tried
Hmm.
different things, or they've seen somebody else in their school do something and then they've given that a go or tweaked it. And essentially that's what I did. And then I was in that context in the UK for almost 4 years. And then I came back to Australia and went straight back into this context where there was nothing. So, but then I could see the value in it because I'd seen all these students achieve their goals. They'd been able to access college after their GCSE levels. Like, I could see, although there were so many ways that the data was mishandled and not used well and done in a really poor way, there was so much value in in how I'd been able to kind of use it with students. So that was kind of why I pursued roles initially, my doctorate, and then yeah, now I'm doing this full time and have been for 5 years.
Yeah, and so a lot even there because you're kind of like I feel like you're reading the narrative of my mind for the past year while you're saying this like previous experience. But I guess like first before you go any further, like what did you kind of mean by like data being mishandled? What do you think? Like what are they like? You're not tracking like boogers picked per semester for grade 6 kids. Like that's still data, that's still something, but like that's not what you're tracking. So is it like certain things you're looking for, certain things that like were being looked for but shouldn't have been?
Yeah, it's a few different things. It's the weighting that the UK system particularly put on external, oh, sorry, the exit results at the end of secondary school. So essentially my performance as a middle leader was judged on the one metric that happened every 12 months. We are so much more than just one number that comes out at the end of 12 months. Obviously, there is so much work that we do. We have so many different influences and impacts on our young people. But in the UK, in the school I was in, it was a pretty high pressure environment. That was essentially used, if you hit your target and your goal, then it was okay, you did your job. And if you didn't get the target, you were performance managed. So that was one part of it, this real over reliance on a single metric to ascertain your contribution. From a leadership perspective, we were really fearful about not hitting our targets. We
So
were
what was your
really,
target? Is that like the pass rate they wanted you to get to?
yeah. So
Okay.
I was expected to double the pass rate in my first year. So to go from 25-ish% to they wanted me to crack 50% pass rate. And that was based on some of the historical data as well, which in the UK was also problematic because the predicted they were all given a predicted or target grade, and that was based on, at the time, the results of assessments that they had done 3 years prior
That's kind of
in maths,
crazy.
and in
Here's this
maths,
thing from
English, and
grade
science.
9 that you did. Like, this is what we
Yeah,
think you are.
yeah. And look, there is a lot of correlation between how students perform earlier, in the middle school compared to senior secondary. There is a strong correlation between that. But when you're using a maths, English, and science result to predict how a student is going to go in physical education, like there's big issues with that model. So it was really hard, I guess, for some students who were very academic, who had exceptionally high target grades, but may not have been very good athletes, but loved sport.
Hmm. Yeah.
And vice versa. There were students who were not particularly academic, who were exceptional athletes. And so the targets that they were set were not they didn't actually match what they were capable of in the subject. So there was a lot of game playing just to kind of get them over the line. And the
Yeah.
last thing I'll say is that we were ranked as teachers. So we would
Yeah.
come,
Okay. I have that. That's something yeah. Okay. Continue. Sorry.
yeah, well, at the start of the academic year, we would come back and the teachers' value added with our names would be ranked from top to bottom on the first
Teacher
day.
value.
Yeah, so
The
bad.
teacher value added is crazy. What did they like? Would the teacher value added be like, oh, if you had 25% success, but now it was 42, like, do you add 17%? Is that like kind of what the.
No, it was based on the target. So if a student was predicted to get a B, and they got an
Mhm.
A, then you added one extra grade to what they were expected to get.
Hmm.
So in theory, if your value add was 0, students got the result that they were predicted, which is so bad. Like, imagine saying to a teacher, your
Yeah.
value add 0.
Well, and like also too, like you think about, and this is an obvious response of a student might be a B student, but then like goes through a tough time or has a parent get sick and now they're failing everything. And it's like, no, now you're -3 value
Yeah.
added. And it's like, okay, you're actually value removed. So like, was that tied to incentive? Was that tied to like, how did they, was it kind of just if you got hired back or not? Was that kind of the way it went?
No, it wasn't. At the time, it wasn't attached to incentives. Not long after I left, performance-based pay was introduced into the UK in some contexts. It was never something for me, but yeah, that is something that contributes to performance-based pay. But it's also something that you'd apply for jobs with. Like your cover letter,
Yeah.
you would lead with, this is the pass rate that it was, and this is what I got it to, and this is the value add that I contribute. So yeah, really reducing humans to numbers, which it's not what I'm about.
Yeah. And I guess even for you, like let's just say if you were consulting on something when it comes to we're trying to figure out how to do our teacher value added for our district so we can figure out who to pay more. That's a very daunting question, first off. But two, my immediate response, and I wouldn't even know how to figure this out, is well, how do I know that teachers aren't kind of like nudging the grades along to get a little extra cheddar for Christmas? So you know what I mean? So like I guess how did in your experience have you been asked that, and like what would you advise like to make sure that it's actually legitimate? Like is there still a standard exam they have to pass based on the teacher? Like is that like kind of how it's, and I'm kind of acting asking you more like structural questions. It's not specifically like what you would consult on, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess in the UK there wasn't, the equalizer was the external assessment that the teacher wasn't actually allowed to be in, and it was supervised by other people, and that was almost the leveler. But I was having a lot of conversations with, and this is the kind of the conversation that I try to lead now, is actually about understanding the numbers and what they mean. Because so for me, I was given a group of students who were expected to fail everything, right? So their predicted grades in across the board were D's or E's. But they came into like a sport and recreation subject. So when I got them through and they passed, they got a C, but they actually got 2 C grades because that was kind of the course that I took them through. So my value added always looked amazing because I was given this group of kids who were really low when I got them through a vocational subject. But if you think about a teacher who's, say, teaching philosophy or English literature, where they've got a group of students who are expected to get A's and A pluses, if the student who's predicted an A plus gets an A plus, on paper, your value add is 0.
Yeah.
That's just not okay. And so that's
Yeah.
the conversation I want to have is there's a piece around, yes, we want to be able to look at what is more effective, what has a greater impact, what strategies are moving schools and classrooms and districts along faster than others, absolutely. But we can never just reduce this to a value add measure, because you getting your whole class through A's and A pluses in English literature and what I do in my vocational subject in sport, we're working just as hard as one another. And I don't necessarily deserve any more pay
It's
or
like you're
accolades than
10
you
more
do.
teachers than I am.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's just not right. So that's, I guess now I really advocate against that use of comparison in that way and the attachment of those kinds of metrics to things like pay, because I guess sometimes teachers haven't thought that through, or like system leaders haven't kind of thought that through. When you've got really high performing students, it's not that the teachers are not absolutely working their guts out. They're working really hard and contributing a lot. That's just not the measure to use. I don't actually think there is a measure, is my answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I haven't been in a situation where data has been used for like a teacher value added. I've tried to look into like how do you quantify teacher performance, and clearly this is one of the ways, but again, very flawed in kind of what you're discussing. And so I want you to walk me through like you go back to Australia, who I think arguably have a new skill set, because I do think they complement one each other. They complement one another in the sense of you can track like the work that's going on in the school while you're going through it and going through your courses that you're teaching. But I do think there's value in having some sort of a like full and like final assessment that actually lets them not that you're like testing them, but they can actually demonstrate that, you know what, I showed up most of the days, I kind of figured this out, I kind of know what I'm talking about if I'm asked to, and then not making that the be all end all. So I guess how did you take what you learned in the UK back to Australia? How did that kind of change things? And like the second part I want to add to that is for us in New Brunswick in Canada, it's like the triangulation of data of like conversations, observations, and products. So there is kind of this recognition of all three being equal. So I guess how did you kind of apply that? And did you apply it in the same way that we do?
Yeah, I really like that. What did you say? Conversations, observations, and
Observations
product.
and products. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I guess when I came back, I noticed that the difference, and that's kind of what motivated me to start my doctorate because I wanted to investigate more of those kind of positive impacts of using data with students. And then I guess Australia started, I guess historically what happened was that the use of data and evidence to inform teaching practice was written into national policy and framing documents in 2008. So there was starting to kind of be a bit of there was more interest in the use of data. People didn't know what it looked like, but we were kind of almost forming the national opinion and perspective on what we do in schools around the use of data. And so since 2008, that's been increasing over time. And I guess I was in the right place at the right time with the right experience, and I'd kind of done the work that really kind of supported where nationally we were talking about going. And so not only did it pique my curiosity around my doctorate, but schools started employing people in student data and performance roles. And I did a couple of these roles in schools. And to be honest, the senior leaders, they didn't know what they wanted the role to look like. I basically had to ideate and create a role and work out kind of what the priorities were and what we were going to track. And then just over time, I guess there's been more and more conversation about it. And as you know, I say I'm a data storyteller, but I'm also a grounded researcher. The more that I work in this space, the more I learn. You know, every year there's new products, there's new tech platforms, there's
Mm-hmm.
new thinking. The field of data storytelling worldwide is just evolving at a rapid rate across sectors. So it's not just education specific. And so I guess I'm trying to pull the pieces from the corporate sector that fit and align with the school sector the best. And that's why I think I really latched onto data storytelling quite early because I could see that this merger of humans and numbers was most likely going to resonate with teachers. And it was also what motivated me. You know, it was the conversations I was having with 16, 17-year-old kids in the UK about their performance that essentially was what motivated me. Data storytelling almost gave me the frame to which I could launch my work from because I was like, hey, it's actually got a name. I'm not just here saying, what are the actions and what do you do and what are the next steps and so what? And they were the prompting questions I used early on in my kind of career as a consultant. But once I learned about data storytelling, I was like, that's it. That's absolutely teachers at the end of the day teach because they want to make a difference to young people. And that's got to be the main part of the narrative. Data is a tool that supports that really good decision making. And as you say, that idea of triangulation, and I kind of alluded to it with the UK, you know, the UK just focus on product and that single metric. That was it. Whereas all the work I do now, I encourage people to make decisions based on a range of information because we know every data set has noise and bias in it. No data set's ever going to be perfect. So by triangulating, we're able to say, well, okay, on balance, what's the general trend or insight happening across this range of information? And then if we know that, then what do we do? And we just hold that belief then with more conviction because we've got more evidence that it's actually a thing.
Yeah. And because I would say that now that I'm about a year into this new role that I'm in the new district, like I said to my coach the other day, because we have like literacy and numeracy coaches that will come in like from the district and kind of work with us. And I'm like, I'm starting to drink the Kool-Aid a little bit. Like I think at first I'm like, this just seems like arbitrary almost. Like I came from like I taught grade 12 in Alberta. So I taught high school, and then at the end of each semester was their exam that's worth 30%. It used to be worth 50% when I was in high school. So I'm very familiar with it being pretty much literally the be all end all for what I was doing. And because I thought it was so strange, like it was very much culture shock to me, even though I'm like from this area, generally speaking. But I will say the debates that we've had within my own circle and I've talked about it probably a bit on the podcast. If anyone's listening again, sorry if I'm going to repeat myself here. So the new role that I'm in this year is called an academic support teacher, which is like a sect of a resource team where like you kind of have like your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 students. Tier 3 is kind of like I guess like very large needs, I guess, in the classroom, mostly like one-on-one EA support. Tier 1 is pretty much, yeah, your students are all at instructional level. They should be fine. They should not require any extra assistance outside of being accommodated. And then I'm like the tier 2 guy for the school. So I have about 160 students that I kind of combed through. And so where we had the discussion was the way that I track my data is actually based on how the student is performing at grade level. So to me, it almost seemed from the start like picture a spreadsheet with like 10 different sections, and there's probably like 15 to 20 different like indicators on each one. And all of those indicators is like a specific thing that the student like should be able to say at the end of it, like, I can do this. From that, you get a number of 1 to 4. So for myself, it's like, okay, like if I do an initial screener and an assessment with them and they're at a grade 4 reading level, but they're in grade 8. So that means like technically I would give them a 1 on most things reading, right? That's where they require additional support. But like if they go from a 4, like a grade 3 reading level to like a grade 7 reading level, like they're still technically below. So they're still like a 1, but like my teacher value added has actually produced something, but it's still a 1. So I would say, like, and I promise I'm not asking on behalf of the district. This is kind of just my own like wonderings, but we were kind of struggling with like, how do we convince teachers to also use this tool, not just us, because they're already kind of being asked to do so much, but then that we can also demonstrate a movement upwards in grade level as well. So this is kind of getting into the nitty gritty of like what a spreadsheet should look like. And like, are we tracking too much? Like, I know one of our discussions was kind of like condensing it into, instead of having like 70, you kind of move it into like 30 of them. That's a bit more like, maybe you have a scale of 1 to 20, and a 1's grade 1 and a 20 is like grade 8. You know what I mean? So I guess what are your thoughts on that jumble of like even like my new position made to kind of target that, and like the expectations for all teachers of how to engage with that data and what to.
Yeah, I mean that role is really common even in Australia. We have a lot of people in like literacy numeracy kind of coach roles. I guess the shift that I'm seeing in the Australian education sector is that less and less those tier 1 or tier 2 students are being taken out of class. It's more about how do we build capacity of teachers in the classroom to differentiate between the tier 1 and 2 students and provide different learning opportunities for them. Obviously, tier 3 students are often in explicit intervention support programs as well.
Some are adjusted.
Yeah, and that obviously often happens outside the classroom. But again, it's how is a classroom teacher supporting them in the best way possible when they're in the room with them. But I guess to the tracking question, the first thing I would say is, you know, what we choose to track and put in a spreadsheet is totally dependent on what we value and what the subject area or the inquiry or focus area, I guess, determines success looks like. So for me as a maths teacher, I collected different data to when I was teaching physical education. I taught a lot of science. I taught a lot of study of religion. I taught marine studies. I've taught senior biology. The data and my spreadsheets looked different for every one of those class groups because you've got to, it's the idea of the lag and lead data, where lag data is the big chunky kind of historical information that we can't change, and we might be setting goals around that and their success in the future. But the lead indicators are those smaller bits of data that we collect along the way that are giving us information about whether or not we're on track and whether we're on, I guess, likely to see success and experience change on the other end. So in schools, the lag and lead concept fits really nicely into like summative and formative assessment. So kind of what you're talking about in your spreadsheet is like those lead indicators where you're doing much smaller bits of data collection along the way, going, well, are we having an impact? Are we moving in the right direction? So then the next bit I would add to that is then one of the things that data can do when we do it well is that it makes that progress really visible. So the growth that's happening from a 1 to a 1 is not visible, even though you know that there is additional growth there. So I guess my question would be, rather than using, say, the 1, it'd be, is there a way to write a year 3, like grade 3, then grade 7? Because you can then kind of do a comparison and go, well, that it's the same data, it's the same student, it's the same results, but the progress is visible. So for me, that's what it's about. It's like if a student gets a B last year in grade 7 and they get a B in grade 8, they've actually had to improve to maintain that same
Yeah.
grade because the difficulty has increased. So I'm really kind of about, how do we see the movement really clearly, and how do we make it obvious?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
yeah, keep going.
Oh no, that's just, I think the only other thing would be, how do you make the data pieces that you collect smaller? So in Australia, I work with a lot of schools with high proportions of First Nations students. And so where for a lot of them there's a big gap in literacy and numeracy proficiency, just tracking whether or not they're at year level is not sufficient. Like, it's too, the metric is too chunky. So for us, we often track through key literacy descriptors. So they're much finer points so that it's more tangible. So we can go, yes, that small thing, there's been success there, but there hasn't been success here. And then you can kind of start to use the data to go, okay, well, I know these are the things they can and can't do, and then where I focus my attention.
And that's something that we've noticed too, where as we've kind of grown with, because it's our first year doing this role at the middle school level. And I feel like with anything, the middle school is always this like Wild West. It's kind of where we go to test everything. We're like, no one really knows what's going on. But like a student can technically be below grade level in reading, but still get like a 4, which is like the highest on specific skill descriptors. Like they might get inferencing 100%, but any sort of like detailed comprehension question, they don't know. So I think that's been helpful to distinguish like the sheets, if I were to show you, are like super overwhelming. Like when I first got them, I was, especially coming from like, no, we write 4 essays, 3 major unit exams, and then 1 diploma. That's our core assessment. That's, I think that would end up being worth 70% of your assessment. The other 30% ends up becoming like performance-based projects that we would do throughout the semester, which were, I find, like the way that I marked those performance-based projects with data now makes way more sense than like with the mark I was giving with I had rubrics for them and like I knew what I was looking for. But I think like being able to mark a way a student actually engages with their group is worthwhile, and it's worth like including in their grade. But yeah, so I think that's been something where it's also weird because now you'll have students that have like 4s and like high levels in some categories. But then when they kind of do their overall exam, they're actually way below grade levels. And I think that comes back to, this is a fun question. Like it makes it interesting knowing that there's like things in education that we're still trying to figure out. And it's not just one way and then that's the way you do it. But and I guess even for myself, having grade level curriculum descriptors for students that I know that are not currently working at instructional level almost seems like I'm shooting myself in the foot before I start the race. And that's kind of been that's been our discussion, and that kind of goes into like being able to show the grade level. But have you ever heard of like ways to specifically even like target tier 2, like because, and I will say, to add to that, our literacy and our math spreadsheets look the exact same. So I think even for what you're saying, like, there could be a way to make it so they don't need to be the same. Yeah, I guess what are your thoughts there? I threw a lot
Yeah.
at you there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. I think it's hard to know. It's hard to know without seeing it.
Yeah.
Can we just? What was your question again?
Yeah. So it's just like, what would you potentially recommend? Like, if you had, like, you know what, we're going to create a position that's made for filling gaps specifically. So it's like, we've got our kind of instructional level things for the grades 6, 7, and 8, but now we got to figure out like, how do we know what to look for to track for the kids that are behind, but we don't know what areas they're behind in?
I guess knowing somebody isn't working at the instructional level is useful, but you don't know where they are, right? So you need to use the curriculum descriptors of the different year levels below to work out at what point they're at. And I guess this speaks to any of the data we're talking about, and some of the examples you gave previously kind of also allude to this. An overall result, like if a student's working 1 year below year level, that's on average, that's on balance, but there'll be parts of that, curriculum descriptors that they can do. There might be parts of the current year level that they're enrolled in that they can do. There would be elements of the previous year again that they can do. And so I guess while it's a lot of work, I've seen it done through what are those kind of key descriptors at a year 3 level, at a year 4 level, at a year 5 level, and then where kind of are they on that continuum. The challenge is that splitting that up for everybody, for every subject area, is really time consuming. And one of the questions you asked before was around like, how do we encourage teachers to look at this and see the value and start to do it? And I think the way, that you're describing it, hypothetically, we couldn't ask teachers to be tracking these small little curriculum pieces off level for every kid in their classes who need it. It's too big. But what we can do is certainly focus on some elements of the curriculum or the subject area that are the most, impactful on overall success. So it's almost that what's the best return on investment in the work that we're doing? And let's focus on that. And so a lot of the secondary schools I work in, they get teachers to do this type of work, say just for one class that they are timetabled on, or in primary it might be that they might focus on like 5 to 10 students only, so they're not tracking extensively in the way you're talking about for every student that they teach. Some secondary teachers are teaching in Australia, they're teaching 150 students in a week. They can't possibly do that micro level assessment all the way through. Yeah, I guess it's being really targeted and specific, but also how do you sell it? The other part that comes up for me is you've got to show those case studies for people to show the movement and the growth. And if the mechanisms you have in place are not allowing that progress to be really visible, it's going to be a really hard sell to teachers. Teachers want to know that it's going to have an impact if they're going to invest all this time and effort. And in some ways, there's some research that kind of says we almost need to make the positives and the good stuff that comes out of any change 3 times bigger than the perceived loss of time and effort that it's going to take to do it.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I think
and even for
that happens in schools too.
Yeah, and I think something that we're learning too, because like where I'm kind of in the school, but I don't have like an actual classroom that I teach specifically. Like I'm kind of working in all of them and pulling kids out. I still have been pulling some students out to do some like literacy program work with them. But what we kind of figured out was like, okay, if you have 70 skill descriptors to get through in a year, and we've got 190 school days, well, it's like you fill out the data. I'm saying data. Wow. The data sheet as you teach. So it's like at the end of every second day, you look at like, okay, I taught this. Like it doesn't have to be done in a day, which I think, especially for me, like being new to the whole thing, like being put in a support role when I'm also new and like I hadn't worked with the curriculum before, that was like, that's just my own thing, but understandable when they're like, okay, we know you're new here, but here's this like massive spreadsheet and then you have to convince people to use this. I'm like, what? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I think in that way, as a teacher fills it out and sees doesn't necessarily matter what grade level they're at. It's like, can they actually perform what I taught? Like, we're not going to punish them for what they haven't been taught yet, which I think is kind of where I'm drinking the Kool-Aid kind of thing. That's what I've been able to see. And that eventually, like, okay, at the end of September, you filled out 5 descriptors and you've got these groups of 4 and 5 with 1s, and that's where I come in. And that's kind of been, I think, the plan for next year. I don't know if I'll be in this role again next year or not, because I'm still like on the first year in the district and on kind of the temp side, but who knows? We're actually talking about moving it to the high school level potentially, like in like a somewhat of a role. Obviously, I will not be able to do math on that front, but perhaps literacy and just literacy down the road for that. But so yeah, the triangulation, and I love what you're saying about like being able to bring what you learned in the UK back to Australia. And I wanted to touch on something I heard you mention on another podcast was like Australia, you said, was it roughly like 15 years behind the UK in their data tracking practices. It seems so obvious that you should be assessing people and tracking them based on like their overall output, not just on what they produce. Like, because how would you define behind? Because again, looking at this, I would now look at Alberta coming from where I just moved from, as being very far behind. Yet in Canada, Alberta is known for having a very successful and should be modeled after education system. So I guess how do you kind of define that like years behind and like that kind of debate? Because I know that's probably a big part of your world.
Yeah, look, that was probably more at a national level, the focus that I
Okay,
guess
yeah,
the
fair enough.
national education system is putting on the use of data and systems and districts in your world. You know, as I said, that the first time we really had data and evidence mentioned at a national level was in 2008. The examples I'm talking about for me was when I was teaching in the UK in 2008. So they were very evolved. You know, when we talk about the use of data in any organization, we talk about almost the maturity level. There's a maturity scale for data and
Yes, okay, I want to talk to you about that.
how well data is embedded in all the decision making and then the actions and then how responsive people are to that. And I guess going from almost level zero in Australia into a high level of data maturity in the UK and then back to zero, I just really noticed the differences between them. And recently, you know, I work with a friend of mine in the UK. I still have a lot to do with him, and he's got this tech program that I kind of use. And he said to me, he said, Selena, a lot of the training you do in Australia, he said it probably wouldn't land in the UK right now. And I was like, yeah, I agree because there is so much pressure on those results and how they're used. People have got to upskill in the use of data. Otherwise, they're performance managed and performance managed out, or they're performance managed to a point that they get it and can respond to the information that they're being given. Obviously, we don't in Australia and in Canada, you don't ever want to get to that point, right? Where that's the way it's being used. So in a way, I'm glad we're behind the eight ball because we can learn all the things not
Yeah.
to do.
Mm-hmm. So
But
you can kind of
equally,
start fresh. Yeah.
yeah, start afresh and know what has worked and what hasn't worked, like in other parts of the world. But you know, in Australia, like in Canada, I imagine it's now a very steep learning curve, and we're trying to work with, you know, I would say 85% of our teaching population who never went through any training on the use of data at university.
Well, and that's what I was gonna say because like I subbed for 2 years while I was in university, so I'm really only actually in my third full year teaching. Like it hasn't. It's not like I've been in very long, so maybe that's a good thing for where I'm starting with data now that I can kind of become more engrossed in it. But like the word was never mentioned
No.
ever, and like I again like whatever like I went to U of A for my and that's like the third ranked education program in Canada and I was like okay like I'm assuming this is where you get the good education from and I went through it and like I remember I even took like an inclusive learning course and in that course like I really like there was nothing about assessment at all and I'm not even data it's not even assessment so I'm like okay and then I get to teaching and I'm like okay so like what do we do here like that, I remember that kind of being the first thing so yeah and I think if I'm ever fortunate enough to teach like university courses or what have you, that would be nice to kind of have both sides of that. So, and now that you've been working in this kind of consulting phase, I guess for in my immediate context, we have like I think 6,000 teachers in New Brunswick total, and I think in the next 3 years, there's almost 1,500 that are expected to retire. So things are looking like a little scary for what the future of this kind of looks like, for how quickly things I think are going to transform. But how do you kind of differentiate the data that's collected from the classroom to the school to the district? Like, what are the different things each? Like, we pretty much touched on the classroom the whole time here. So like when I think about what a school would collect for data, I think about obviously we have like provincial assessments and you're looking at your overall literacy and numeracy scores. That's probably set for you. You don't actually plan for that. Like your rates of absenteeism, like is that kind of what also comes to mind for you? Or like what things should schools look into tracking and how to track them?
Yeah, I think and this kind of comes to a lot of the work I do is around some of that thinking around the, well, what matters to you? There's always going to be things that you don't have control over. Like a school might have specific assessments that the district is telling them that have to be done. In Australia, we have a national assessment, like literacy and numeracy assessment program, and everybody has to do that. So that's something that's obviously dictated to us. There's also another optional assessment that you can do every year, which is actually a really great tool. And some districts mandate that to schools, and then other schools choose to collect information from that tool. I guess for starters, it comes down to school leaders and district leaders being really clear about what they value and what they want them to be collecting. My biggest challenge when I go in and work with districts and with schools is that they haven't always had the time to think strategically and deliberately about, well, what do we value? What do we care about? And actually, what are we going to track? Rather than just kind of things get introduced and new assessments get added in and then new platforms come and there's new data. It's actually up to district and school leaders to start to provide that clarity for teachers around, if you work in this school, in this district, this is what we value and these are the things that we track. And that gives some parameters, I guess, around what the teachers do then in the classroom. But as you were kind of saying, it's more than just learning analytics. So depending, I guess, on what tools they use, I would absolutely be tracking. In Australia, it's tracking, even though you can't change it, but it's an important piece of data, the percentage of students who are First Nations, the percentage of students who have English as an additional language, the levels of adjustments that students require because of disability and the types of
Yes.
disability that they have, attendance, lates like punctuality, student wellbeing is increasingly a focus, and the tracking of student reported wellbeing is increasingly a focus in Australia. And so having overall scores for that for schools is a way of kind of tracking how the school's going over time. But then also perception surveys, like a lot of schools here use annual parent carer, teacher, and student perception surveys to kind of survey the landscape and go, well, are the things that we're putting in place working? So we go back to that piece around triangulation. It's, we can't determine or speak to a school's success on any one of those metrics alone, but it's the holistic picture of, are our kids saying they're well? Are they showing up to school? Are they performing well? Are the parents and teachers and kids happy to come here? Are they achieving good results? And if we can say that collectively, then we know that we're in a really good position. Does that kind of answer your
Yes,
question?
absolutely. Because even I was thinking as you were saying that, bless his heart, my old VP Dave Hurley, shout out. He was doing his doctorate while I was still there, and a lot of times he would like put some of his data scores that he was like using the school to kind of do his research for, and then everyone would make fun of him because he had real citations on there. But like it was mostly about like student surveys, and I know PBIS is pretty popular. Like we were starting it at our school, and we do like way to go tickets for like positive behavior, and then obviously like we track, it was kind of funny actually, like we track how many tickets each grade gets to kind of get them to like kind of compete a little bit, but then we actually saw like like how many teachers were giving them out, like
Yeah,
someone giving out like 200 and someone giving out like 10 so like a soft call it of like you need to reward positive behavior a bit more or less depending on who you were. I personally, I'm horrible at it, where I just don't give out that much because I don't have a classroom, so I'm always kind of everywhere. I don't just have them in my
yeah.
pocket at all times, but maybe I could definitely take my own advice there. And so that kind of makes sense. Like you're not necessarily looking at student performance or anything, but you're looking at, okay, how do we want the school to perform? And I guess I wouldn't even know. Maybe you can tell me, like, what questions have districts asked you? Like, if a full on district, or even like we would have a provincial government, like, what historically have those kind of organizations struggled with when it comes to what they should collect, in your experience, if you've had any?
Yeah, people ask me what they should care about and what they should track, and I put it back on them all the time. And
Like, what should I care about?
yeah, what's they care about? I'm like, you tell me. I'm not in your
Mhm.
context.
Yeah.
You've got to choose the things that are right for you and
Mhm.
be really clear and discerning about that so that you can articulate that to other people. The problems I see at district level in Australia is an over reliance on those output measures. So I was coaching a principal a couple of years ago, and the expectations from the district for her school was that they would get 100% of students in this very top band in the external, in the National Assessment Literacy Numeracy program. And she rang me and said, can we talk about this target that I've been given from the district for the school? I was like, yeah. She said, look, it's an absolute joke that 100, they're saying 100% of kids in this very highest band. And I was like, yeah, it is. She goes, no, but the reason it's a joke, there were 6 kids in her school. There was only 1 student taking this assessment. So
Like
she said,
teacher value added going down.
yeah. She said, I'm either getting 100% or I'm getting 0%. There's
Wow.
nothing in
Okay.
between.
This is one kid. There's a lot of pressure on him.
Yeah, a lot of pressure. And the kid's like 10 or something, right? And
Honestly, I feel like we always forget that. And all these data conversations, like these kids are 11 and 12.
yeah,
And that's kind of where I always go is like, how much are we overthinking? That
totally.
to me is almost like, how much are we like getting too into the weeds? I'm like, what does a 2 mean? What does a 3 plus
Yeah,
mean? And it's like, these kids are 11. Like, I
yeah,
understand there
exactly.
has to be some sort of tracking. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you were saying though about
Oh,
the
it's
district?
it's just that real misuse of targets and then monitoring and just the pressure then from the district on her leadership. And she's going, should I be taking this seriously? I'm like, no, mate, just work with that one student. And so I guess the problem at a district level sometimes is we don't know what we care about. And then the second part is it's almost the opposite. We care too much about one thing. And like the UK, it's that, we're that's the thing we're almost hanging our hat on, is that we want to be able to say that there's been an increase and improvement in literacy and numeracy from one year to the next. And that's really hard when, like in Australia, every time those results come out, there's a comparison or there's a list of the top 5 performing schools in each
Well, the
state and
schools are
territory.
ranked too. I'm like, like this is
It's
just,
so
it's always
bad.
the most affluent areas, shockingly. And
100%.
it's like, okay, why do we even kind of put this out? I understand, like, like, you should be able to kind of look at yourself from year to year for your own school. Like, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, but like the looking at how your school grows, obviously. I think that's like obviously important data. But when you're looking at like, oh yeah, we're still 268, it's like, okay, this is not encouraging.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, but
And
then it's also being realistic about the metrics because, I worked with a school who were tracking in their student perception annual survey around bullying. They were looking at, well, what's the percentage of students that are reporting bullying in this survey? And the percentage of students reporting it across the school and at every year level was like between 4 and 6% of the population was saying, like, I've experienced bullying in the last 12 months. Now, 4 to 6% is so small for, like, in bullying statistics. 4 to 6%, particularly in the middle school, is remarkable. And yet the school's board was saying, how do we decrease that amount? How do we drop the amount? How do we reduce it? How do we get closer to 0? And the school's going, 0% for bullying reporting is unrealistic.
a lie. Yeah, that would be a
Yeah,
lie. Yeah.
yeah, 100%. So it's kind of, I guess, I know I'm kind of jumping all around the place, but
No,
it's
that's fine.
what does a school value? Well, they value being able to monitor the fact that those bullying rates are staying maybe quite consistent year on year. Because as you said, if you weren't looking and then the bullying incidences started to increase over time, you would miss that if you weren't tracking it. But if it's just motoring along at much the same pace and it's quite low and you're pretty happy with where it's at, you still want to know that it's plateauing and it's quite consistent. But again, it comes down to the school leaders making decisions about those valuable data sources and what they want to collect and track, but also through the guidance of the district telling them what they value as well.
Beautiful. And I'm even wondering, are you familiar? I'm not affiliated with them at all, but like Magic School AI, have you heard of them? Okay, well, so
I looked them up because I saw them in your, yeah.
yes. And I only really use them occasionally if I'm like quickly pressed for a worksheet for something. That's kind of been my most use. But I saw it last week that like the spreadsheets that we use, I haven't tried it because I know there's what's the word I'm looking for? You can't just like put your students' data into like servers that could be out of country and all that stuff. But they have a new function that you can like enter your spreadsheets into them and actually have conversations with your data.
Yeah, right.
How do you respond to that? Like, how does that kind of potentially change the game of like you can actually have AI to make groupings for you and tell you what programming you should use for those? Like, how much, if does that kind of weaken potentially our analytical skills with using data because we can do that? And like, how would you even recommend AI companies tread carefully in trying to do some of these things?
At the risk of making you sound like an old middle-aged white dude,
Please do. That's fine.
you remember, I was just what that line you said, I was thinking about when calculators became normal, and it's like, if we use
Yeah.
calculators, Is that math's going to get worse? And what are we doing?
Yes, I know. I know. Honestly, guilty. I say it all the time.
No, look, I think I really see AI, any AI as a real tool to help us. There's programs where you can have subscriptions to them, and the data you put in is not then shared back with the language model, and it's not used to develop an understanding of, or not used to develop the tool. So whether it's the one you're talking about or not, I think what AI has got the potential to do for us is help us identify the trends and insights that we're looking for in the data. And being able to ask questions of your data has existed in, say, Microsoft Excel now for a few years. So that
Oh
aspect of
yeah,
generative
I knew that.
AI,
Definitely.
yeah, yeah. Um, so it's not new, but what it does is it can certainly help that the time that it takes for identifying the trends and insights. And then, to be honest, even if you went to a mainstream like ChatGPT or Notebook LM or Claude or any of the other kind of models, if you used, say, a Microsoft Excel to go, what are the main trends and insights in this data that I should be paying attention to, you could then copy almost that answer into like a chat GPT and go, well, if this is a challenge that I'm seeing for my students in middle school, what are some of the best teaching strategies backed up by evidence that I could use to address this? Or what are some ways of approaching it? As I say, it doesn't really matter what kind of tool you use. There's capacity to get us thinking. And they're, for me, the two data storytelling questions, that they support that thinking around, well, what should I be noticing and seeing in the data and pulling out what's the most significant? And then how do I act on that information in the classroom? Or at the school level, it could be at a school level or a district level. The questions are exactly the same. So, yeah, if we can use Gen AI to help us do that, then why wouldn't we?
So maybe I shouldn't have been as surprised as I was when I saw that. It seems like that's been something
No,
that's been
no.
around for a while, but it's fine. I'll just use my. I do have gray hairs coming in, so it's fine. So I just have a few more questions here to kind of wrap up. And
Yeah.
the first one is, what comes to mind when you think of educational best practices? This is kind of like a 180 from what we've been talking about so far. The origins of this question was I was being evaluated and no big deal. One of the things that I did, my principal said like, oh, that's like an educational best practice. But I never thought about it as like, it was honestly just an activity of having kids move around the room while they were doing it. So it wasn't just them sitting, and it wasn't that crazy. But as soon as he said it, I was like, whoa, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what are educational best practices? Like, what comes to mind for you when you think of?
For starters, the first thing I think of is it's evolving. We're learning more every day about what best practice looks like. And equally, what is best practice for some students in some contexts is not the same as best practice in other contexts with other students. So I was listening to one of Jim Knight's books on instructional coaching yesterday, actually. And he talked about, what works for one kid works for one kid. And that's kind of where we've got to think.
So daunting.
I know, and that's it. We can't teach to 30 different needs in our classroom. Like, that's also the reality. Yeah, best practice. I used the language of best practice a few years ago when a researcher actually shut me down and said, there's no definitive answer for that. We need to talk about good practice, because there are always things that work. Like, we know feedback is effective, for example, but there are some types of feedback. If I just pat you on the back and go, hey, Lucas, well done, you did good, that's nowhere near as
What?
effective as if I sit with you and work out what you've done well and what you can do next and how to improve. So, yeah, I think it's in some ways talking about good practice or more effective, or the practice that has the greatest impact or more impact is language that sits better with me than best practice, because best practice just sounds really definite and definitive to me.
Okay. And honestly, that's a more like charging response. It's like, okay, it's like there's actually, I do like the potentially daunting travels of that. But one question I don't mean to kind of revert back here a little bit, but I did like what you said about, just quickly, if you don't mind, the difference between data informed and data driven. It's
Yeah.
Mike to your face for 1 minute. What do you mean by?
Yeah, and I think it's exactly what we've been talking about here. It's about when we use data with an understanding of the context and the research and what we know about good practice and more effective practice than others, and what we know about from our own professional experience. It's packaging all that up, and when we can make really great decisions that have the students front and center, that's where we're data informed. And data driven for me is that UK example we shared earlier. 1 in 4 have passed. You need to get to at least half pass, like 50% pass rate by the end of
Or
the
you're
year.
fired. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
cool.
exactly. Yeah, so it's yeah,
No, but
that's not right.
and I do love how like that simplifies it so much. I think of like, what do you care about? How do you want to track it? And I think like you kind of create the data you want to track, not like try to look at what everyone else is doing and just try and copy it and hope it sticks with yours, but actually take the initial thought to figure out what you want to do. But the last two are two quotes. Like I'm a big quote guy. And the first one is education is what remains once you have forgotten everything that you've learned in school. So what is it that you think like what is it that you want people to take away from their time with you that they won't get anywhere else?
Big question.
It's a very it's a good sign off one.
Uh, it I think it's the same with why we teach. We want to develop relationships with young people and see the inherent good in them and what they're capable of. And for me, if somebody came to something I ran or listened to this episode or whatever, it's like at the end of the day, if they walk away going, do you know what? It's not I love or hate data. It's actually how do I work with it really well to support kids and just do the best I can, then that's my big message.
Beautiful. And I kind of froze there because I kind of forgot my other one for a second, but it's do not let school get in the way of your education. So, what are some of the things that you feel like you have learned that have helped you become successful and honestly, like become independent, going into consulting? Like, that's a huge move, and you took the risk and you did it. So, I guess, how would you respond to that for someone that's hopefully maybe trying to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, like, and this has come up in my head a few times, and I haven't mentioned it, but the idea of de-implementation in schools and for all of us, like, what do we actually need to stop doing? Um, and it goes hand in hand with the what do I need to do and what might I do, but also what no longer serves me and what can I take off my plate because educators are so busy, so time poor. This is not about making their jobs harder or their lives more difficult. I think we've all got a role to play in simplifying and stripping back or what actually matters. And let's double down on doing that.
Beautiful. Dr. Selena Fisk, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Lucas. Great chat. Really enjoyed it.